Hey everyone, it's Pastor Brian Kelly here with the Cultivate Church Planting Podcast. We're about to get into another exciting episode, but before we do, I need to tell you that this episode and Cultivate Church Planting is part of the Calvary Chapel Cooperative. If you want to learn more about this exciting new ministry within the Calvary Chapel movement, visit calvarychapelcooperative.com. All right, let's get into the episode. All right, welcome to the Cultivate Church Planting Podcast, and we've got another great episode for you today, and I have with me my very dear and close friend, Mr. Pastor Bruce Zachary. Welcome, Bruce.
Hello, Brian. It's so good to be with you, man. I appreciate you. You are such a gifted host and a good friend and someone who can relate to blue collar, white collar, and no collar, and that's a gift.
Speaking of collars, someone from my congregation got me a one of those official reverend collars because I made a.
Wow.
I was talking about being going to the hospital and doing hospital visits and stuff like that. And sometimes they don't take me seriously with my T-shirt and tattoos, so I said I needed one, and sure enough, next week I had one. So
now you have one. That's fantastic. That's funny.
I've never worn it, but it's nice to have just in case.
Well, if you'll allow me to digress, I'll tell a quick story. Karen and I, my wife and I, were in Reno, and Karen wanted to go to a steak dinner. And so we had to walk through a casino to get to the steakhouse. And I'm not a gambler, so I don't really know anything. But my wife wanted to sit down at the blackjack table. And there was a guy wearing a priest frock. And I asked him how long he'd been ordained. And he said he just got ordained that morning. And I said, that's awesome. And my wife said, it's Halloween. And I felt like such an idiot.
Oh, that's funny. Well, Bruce, you've already got 2 strikes against you. You went out on Halloween and you were in a casino, so this is going to be a great episode.
It's go uphill from here. It's going uphill.
Yeah, exactly. No, I really appreciate you, Bruce, for being on the show today and all the hard work you've done in Calvary Chapel over the years. And can you just, I'd love to talk about church planting, obviously, the Calvary Chapel Church Planting Manual that you wrote and your history in Calvary Church Planting. But let's get started by maybe if you just share briefly your history and testimony with Calvary Chapel and Chuck Smith and kind of where you're from.
Yeah, so I was raised in an observant Jewish home. My upbringing was in the Orthodox tradition, and so I was working as an attorney in downtown San Diego, and as I had been recruited by a firm to come to Orange County, a real estate agent was showing me some property, and as we drove by this house that said, "Praise the Lord," and Coca-Cola script on the garage, I'd make a mocking comment every time. And he invited me to come to church, and it was Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. And I remember a guy and his wife came out with an acoustic guitar. It was John and Lisa Wickham, I found out later, Phil and Evan's parents. And I was in the back pew at Costa Mesa that probably sat 75 people. And I'd sat myself at the end so I could make a quick escape. But they did that Calvary Crunch thing. Now I was in the middle with 30 Gentiles on either side of me. And when the guy with the guitar and the gal came out, everybody stood up and they closed their eyes and they had their hands in the air. I'd never seen this in the synagogue, and people were actually worshiping God. And I was being stirred. And then Chuck came out. I had no idea who Pastor Chuck was, and everybody around me opened their Bibles, and I'd never seen that in the synagogue. We were the custodians of the scriptures, but my people didn't read the Bible like these Gentiles were reading the Bible. So here's all these Meshuggah Gentiles singing with their hands raised in the air, their eyes closed, and their Bibles are all highlighted. And I was being stirred to jealousy before I even read anything about that in Romans. And I asked the real estate guy if I could hold on to the Bible that he let me borrow. And in that Bible, there was a table of messianic prophecies and where they're recorded in the Old Testament and where they're fulfilled by Jesus in the New Testament. And so I knew what evidence was. I was a trial attorney, and I knew evidence beyond a reasonable doubt as a legal standard. And the case for Jesus being our people's Messiah was just overwhelming. And I remember on a Wednesday night at the college and career group at Calvary Costa Mesa, after going to church for about a month, the pastor was doing an overview of the book of Hebrews, and he gave an invitation. And I wanted so desperately to raise my hand, but I thought I was going to be like the trophy Jew, that they'd put me up in the gymnasium next to the volleyball championship banners. And so in the car, it's like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know if I have to do this with a pastor. I don't know if I'm saying the right words. But Jesus, I am ready to follow you as our people's Messiah, as my Lord and Savior. And I experienced the sensation of a peace that I had never experienced in all of my BC efforts to fill that hole that was inside of Bruce. I finally felt that that hole was filled, and it was the most wonderful feeling. And that's how I got saved. And then I started serving at Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa. My wife and I had a Bible study at our home with about 45 or 50 people at it, and Pastor Chuck invited me to come to the School of Ministry at Costa Mesa. And after that, I started teaching at the School of the Bible at Costa Mesa with David Guzik, and had some opportunities to be an interim pastor and to speak at some conferences. And a little over 30 years ago, planted Calvary Chapel of Camarillo, now known as Calvary Nexus. So Chuck came and dedicated the building. Chuck was my pastor, so Calvary Chapel is my tribe. And
and you just celebrated a pretty big milestone recently at your church, right?
Yeah, so we celebrated 30 years. The church started in our living room a little over 30 years ago. Alistair Begg, who's a friend, came out to teach at the services, and felt really special, kind of surreal. It seemed in a second, like it had gone by in a second. And the church was gracious enough to put together a Shutterfly photo album that just documented with 300 photos, 30 years of ministry. And so very special for my wife and I, and for our church.
Wow, that's great, Bruce. And I've been to your church. It's amazing. You've got a beautiful facility, and they've got a great pastor. Actually, pastors, you're part of a pastor team now.
Yeah, thank you, friend, for saying so. And I hope it won't be the last time that I'm out there. And as I'm looking at West Church, I'm just imagining all those seats behind you filled. And I know that that's the case. And I can't wait to get back to West Church in February, January, when we do our next cooperative gathering out there.
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of the cooperative, we've got our website out, and we're starting to kind of develop a little bit of gatherings and things like that. Of course, we've always had the resources of Expositors Collective, Cultivate Church Planting, When She Serves, which was formerly When She Leads, and also a Pastor's Connection that you're pretty heavily involved in. We can talk about that in a minute. But what I want to talk about today, by way of church planting, is something really, really valuable. I can't say this enough. And for the amount of people that I've seen use this resource, not only in the United States, but many other countries, is the Calvary Chapel Church Planting Manual. And can you just give us a brief little overview about what this manual is, Bruce?
Yeah, so in 2010, we were preparing to send church planters out to plant in Portland. And I have a friend, we have a mutual friend who serves with us as part of the Cultivate team at Compion. And Ed was in the same place. He was in Nairobi, Kenya, preparing to train church planters. And between us, we had accumulated approximately 15 books on church planting. And all of them were really marketplace ideas for church growth rather than biblical ideas, which are that biblical perspective is so rooted in Calvary Chapel. And so Ed and I had both created various documents, and we thought we could do something better. So we decided to pray for 2 weeks, and 2 weeks later we came together. And I said, Ed, what do you have? And he goes, I'm going to use the Book of Acts as a model. And I go, that's fantastic. How are you going to organize it? And my friend went silent on the other end of the line. And he said, okay, what do you got? And I said, well, I'm thinking like, who should plant? In other words, what are the characteristics of someone who is qualified to church plant? Why we need to plant from not only a theological perspective, but a missiological perspective. Churches close, new ones need to start, unreached people, etc. And then talking about what Calvary Chapel is all about, that if I didn't have Calvary distinctives and I had to articulate from the ground up what I understood to be some of the essentials that make Calvary Chapel in regard to our philosophy of ministry and our systematic theology, what would those factors be? And then a section on how to plant. In other words, some various models of church planting. And then I included 20 lessons that you didn't learn in Bible college or seminary. In other words, budgeting, how to officiate a memorial service, how to officiate a wedding, how to do biblical counseling, board meetings, raising up elders and deacons, baptism, not necessarily the theology of baptism per se, but when somebody my size, 5'4", is baptizing somebody who's 6'4", 280, that guy thinks he's going to go to be with Jesus that afternoon. And so understanding, about rotating the hips and about leverage and some of those lessons that you didn't learn in Bible college or seminary. And then we included an appendix on how to teach teachers to teach the Bible. In other words, we put such an emphasis on expository Bible teaching as a movement, but often we neglect to teach people how to teach the Bible. And I think Expositors Collective has done a great job in doing that.
Yeah.
And to make that approachable in a one-on-one mentoring from a planter and the mentor, or for use in a local church. And so those were really the elements of what the manual is all about. So that was about 2011. 2010, 2011, but the impetus really, it was born out of failure. We had started a Calvary Chapel in Walnut Creek in East Bay, San Francisco, California, and that church still exists. But the planter who went out to start that church, his marriage doesn't. And I recognized that I wasn't personally responsible for that situation, but I also recognized that if I had done a better job to prepare him and to support him post-launch, that perhaps things would have been differently. And that's really the impetus for the Church Planter Training Manual. So I was trying to get some perspective on whether it would work cross-culturally. And so I got Ed to give a pair of eyes on it. He was in Nairobi, Kenya. Juan Domingo, who was in, at the time, Ensenada in Baja California, Mexico. And then got David Guzik to make sure that there was theological alignment between our Calvary Chapel philosophy and ministry and systematic theology and what I had written. And one of these guys, and I'm not sure who, got it into Chuck's hands. And Chuck went through it, and he thought it was great. And so he asked me to change it from Calvary Chapel Camarillo to Calvary Chapel Church Planter Training Manual, and to send it out to the database. Yeah, he had Roger Wing.
That's interesting.
Roger Wing gave me the coveted database, and so there were about 1,700 at the time that I sent it out to.
That's very interesting because, a lot of times, and I came up in Calvary Chapel, haven't been around it as long as you have, Bruce, but I'm on my way. And, and I just remember as a young man going through Bible college and then going into pastoral ministry, wanting to be a pastor, and then going into pastoral ministry, there was almost kind of like a negative kind of pushback for anything other than just pray, trust in the Holy Spirit, where God guides, God provides, God be with you, good luck.
Yeah. So
it's interesting I'm saying that because it's interesting to hear that it was the founder of Calvary Chapel, Chuck Smith, who was the one that was eager for you to get this resource into people's hands.
I think it's a false dichotomy when we say that Chuck was reliant on the Spirit and therefore he didn't have intentional strategic means. I mean, when he started the Bible College at Twin Peaks, it was because he was getting requests for church plants back in the tent days, and he didn't have the ability to train people as quickly as the need arose, and that's what really started Calvary Chapel of Twin Peaks, and then later the School of Ministry to support church planting. So I would say that Chuck was far more intentional as well as Spirit-led, and it's a false dichotomy to say if one the other. I have spoken now at probably over 100 conferences on church planting, and I typically ask people, like, how many of you learned to swim by having somebody throw you into the pool? And if there's, let's say, 100 prospective church planters there, maybe 7 of them raise their hand. And I say, how many of you taught your kids to swim that way? And all of them put their hands down. In other words, It was traumatic. Learning how to swim without someone teaching you how to swim is not the best way to say, if you're anointed, you'll be successful. Yeah, I agree that without the anointing, being trained by someone to church plant or reading a manual isn't going to help you. But if you've been anointed, having that manual or any other suitable resource, and because it's entirely biblical and it's consistent with the Calvary Chapel philosophy of ministry and systematic theology, it's just a tool. In other words, it's like having one of those big Swiss Army knives in your desk drawer. If there's a need that arises, you can go back and use it, but you don't have to use that tool. It's there like a bridge to help you.
Yeah. I love that analogy of swimming because, of course, we remember getting thrown in and, drown. It's like you feel like you're drowning and you got to be saved over and over again. And from the parents' perspective, because I've thrown my kids in before, of course I have, that's just a confession. But it's almost like with church planting, it's like some of us guys, I've done this before, so I'm confessing, but it wasn't right. We think, hey, I know how to swim. So therefore, when I throw you in, you're going to know how to swim. It's like we subconsciously think, if I can do it, well, of course you can do it too. But we don't realize we've had, whether formal or informal training along the way, that we don't even realize. What better way to get started swimming than to have someone teach you from the basics all the way up?
Yeah, or we applaud someone for their flailing. Like, wow, look how good they're flailing. This is a prospective church planter.
He's really trying.
Yet. Yeah. It's interesting that when we made this available, and I personally didn't see the Google Analytics because I'm a boomer, but the people on our team who were overseeing the Google Analytics told me that it was downloaded over 33,000 times in the first 2 years.
That's great.
And in a movement that is characterized by about 1,700 churches, it was going well beyond the Calvary Chapel circle or our tribe. Todd Wilson, who was overseeing Exponential, and Exponential is the largest church planting entity on the globe. I mean, it's even beyond North America. And Todd Wilson was the president at the time, and he got a hold of the resource and said, this is the best resource I've seen on church planting, and asked me if he could use it for his local church in Virginia. And that's when I knew that we were onto something that had some tread.
Yeah, and I think it's the simplicity of it and the thoroughness of it. I mean, that's really what gets me. Is it's not a huge manual. It's not like you're going to read volume after volume, but it's got enough, just the right information on just the right topics. For example, there's stuff in there about registering with the government and how do you do a nonprofit and stuff like that. It's got very clear guidelines on all this stuff. So I think it's just the right balance in that space. And of course, we use it with Cultivate all the time. Every one of our prospective planters we're recommending. And I would even say this to our listeners, whether you're with Calvary Chapel or not. Most of our listeners are Calvary Chapel, but there are many who are not. You can download this resource for free. Bruce, how do we get the manual?
Yeah, so it's available on the Cultivate site and cultivatechurchplanting.org, and it's translated into 8 or 9 different languages. So most people that are interested in church planting have access to that in their own language, in their own tongue. And it was written with the intention that it could be used in Nairobi, Kenya, as well as Camarillo, California, a suburb in Southern California, Lima, Peru, Manhattan, New York City, Manhattan, Kansas. And it could be used in a church of 50 people or 500 people or 5,000 people. And it was written that way. And the stories that I've added in each of the sections regarding a pastor's perspective helps to communicate some of my experience, but recognizes also the cross-cultural limitations in my context that might apply. For example, we had a church planter in Tanzania, and his question was, if I move the dove to a different tree every Sunday, can we be at Calvary Chapel? He was a Maasai tribesman, and so they're nomadic East African tribesmen. And so if his tribe was meeting under a different tree every Sunday, could they still be Calvary Chapel? And I've never received that question before from the States. And
Yeah. As long as he's
yeah.
10 miles away from another tree.
That's hysterical. Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, and so it was intended to share biblical principles, and biblical principles tend to translate across cultures, and they tend to translate across time. And so,
and that's a great point, Bruce. I heard recently a criticism, and I've rarely heard criticisms about the Church Planting Manual because I've read it myself, and it's very biblical. Saying that, we don't need these business, quote unquote, business principles to come in and tell us how to do church planting. And there are a lot of, steps and processes that you point out in the book. But as you mentioned, very biblical. How would you respond to someone that's like, this is just a...
Yeah, that is so ironic because, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, that Pastor Ed Compion and I had gone through it literally 15 or more books on church planting that essentially were focused on marketplace ideas. And in response to that, the two of us sought to create a resource that was entirely biblical based, absent any marketplace ideas. So the idea that this was some slick Madison Avenue approach to church planting is preposterous. It just sets forth a description of who should plant, and that's just looking at the best missiological research, taking a look at the research, the diagnostic research that Ed Stetzer has composed, why we need to plant, not only from a theological basis, looking at the book of Acts, but also the number of churches closing compared to the number of churches starting, and areas outside of Orange County, California, in the United States, where more churches are needed, as well as a detailed discussion of what Calvary Chapel is. I have the utmost respect for Pastor Chuck. He was my pastor, but he didn't write Calvary Distinctives to set forth all of our positions regarding philosophy of ministry or systematic theology. That was not the purpose of that resource. Mm-hmm. And then trying to explain to people various approaches in church planting, and then some really practical lessons in regard to teaching as well as other lessons. And again, I was contacted in the first 2 years by literally hundreds of Calvary Chapel pastors who were saying, where were you 20 years ago? Where were you 30 years ago? Where were you 10 years ago? In other words, this was information that people in our tribe were hungry for, that had previously not been provided to them. And now they were benefiting from it, and why not let the next generations, or more appropriately, generations, avail themselves of this or whatever other resource gets created in the future that will help them to plant Calvary Chapels more effectively. Yeah, if I could go on real quick. As we started in the late 1960s and into the 70s, if you were to graph Calvary Chapel's church planting experience, it looked like a hockey stick. But as we reached the 90s, there was this plateau. And once this resource was made available so that planters could be trained in the context of the local church, again, we started to see a hockey stick trajectory. And again, now another 15 years, 10 to 15 years have passed, and now Cultivate is seeking to create the infrastructure to once again to re-engage in the church planting that has been part and parcel of the Calvary Chapel history of our movement.
Yeah, that's
we've
right.
We've been one of the more effective.
Exactly, and people may be surprised to hear that God is working in other places beyond just the United States. In fact, the majority of our church planters that we're working with and training and are coming into the Cultivate program that we're doing are from other countries. We've got just tons of guys planting in Mexico, guys like Mike Vincent and his crew. They're really big fans of you, yourself, Bruce, and of the Church Planting Manual. And, I'm thinking about East Africa, where Ed was and I myself was ministering for a lot of years. We're just seeing a big increase. Eastern Europe, all these places that they see the need for new churches. God works in different places at different times, and I'm so glad to be able to offer something biblical from a Calvary Chapel perspective that we can give to them through Cultivate and through the Church Planting Manual.
Yeah, that we say around Cultivate circles that the gospel is the hope of the world, and the world needs more gospel-centered churches. And having a 30,000-foot level where we're focused on a global perspective rather than simply the United States or particular sections of the United States is really helpful for us to understand that Calvary Chapel is a global movement of churches. And it started in Southern California and had significant influence there, undoubtedly. But we are global, and we should continue to be a global. I think the future is looking bright for the Calvary Chapel family of churches. I recognize that God doesn't need Calvary Chapel. I know that's a shocking statement to some ears, but I also recognize that Christendom is better when healthy expressions of Calvary Chapel are prevalent around the globe. And so I'm excited.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's talk about something new that's coming up, and we've been working on, me and you, Bruce, and several others, and the Calvary Chapel Cooperative. You want to just give a brief overview of what we're doing, and since you and I are a big parts of this, so.
Yeah, and so we believe that it is helpful to have a relational community that is committed to serving the Calvary Chapel family of churches for the purpose of equipping and encouraging and creating meaningful relational community. And that's why in the beginning of 2026, we formed the Calvary Chapel Cooperative. You and I had been involved, along with Nick Cady, in the Cultivate Church Planting Initiative. Others on our team had been involved in an initiative that was created for the purpose of equipping women and empowering women for roles that were consistent with serving and leadership in a complementarian perspective, that we do not view women as qualified for the role of being the ultimate arbiter of doctrine. We would not recognize a woman for the role of pastor or elder, and yet we recognize that women are fantastic leaders and should have open lanes to serve in the local church. The Expositors Collective that Mike Neglia has been leading has been equipping pastors for the public proclamation of the word, as well as lay leaders to be better equipped to publicly proclaim the word from a Christ-centered perspective. And then we started an initiative called the Pastor's Connection, and the purpose of that was to recognize that many of the Calvary Chapel pastors that we know and love and the leaders have felt disconnected and have felt isolated in their calling. And that's a shame. We're a family of churches, and to proactively reach out to make sure that leaders that are connected to the cooperative are cared for and that coaching support is offered to them, I think is critical. I remember reaching out to a Calvary Chapel pastors a large Calvary Chapel church in another state outside of the one where I serve, and his comment to me was, in 35 years of pastoral leadership, no one connected to Calvary Chapel has ever reached out to me before. I can't tell you how much that means to me. And I recognize just the need to provide that intentional support and encouragement to people.
Yeah, because we need each other, and I'm just even thinking about it from a church planting perspective. It's like when you plant the church, the plant date is not the end of the process. It's just the beginning, and you need not just cultivate guys and coaches and stuff to kind of support along the way, but you need other pastors that are in the trenches working together to bounce ideas off, to have complaints and have encouragement, all that.
Yeah, interesting you say that. The empirical research shows that 85% of church planters report feeling discouraged or depressed. And the three primary reasons for that are inadequate training, unreasonable expectations, and then third, post-launch support that's lacking. In other words, lacking post-launch support. And when we created the model for Cultivate, it sought to address all three of those issues. There's an intentional church planting preparation that takes anywhere from 6 to 24 months, generally 6 to 12 months, sometimes 18, sometimes 24. There is an intentional setting of expectations to avoid unreasonable expectations. In other words, over 65% of churches in this country have adult and child attendance on weekends that are less than 100. So when everybody thinks that their church is going to be a mega church, it's an unreasonable expectation. And to set the expectations correctly. And then third, we've created a system that provides for monthly post-launch support in the first year, and then quarterly post-launch support at least during the second year, and an in-person visit at least one time in the first and the second year. And that's a game changer. It changes the three primary factors that result in discouragement and depression for church planters.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Bruce. I love that information because it makes you aware of the need that's out there and how are we going to help, by God's grace, to meet that need. Bruce, we've got a few more minutes. You got a word of encouragement for our listeners who are maybe getting ready to plant or are planted and maybe feeling discouraged? What are you going to say to these guys?
Yeah, I think church planting is not for the faint of heart, but it is a good and noble calling. And certainly what I know today is far different than what I knew 30 years ago when I planted. But having somebody take me under their wing and mentor me, equip me to get started, and then having a mentor that I could reach out to who, might be my sending church, might not be, and then a coach who can assist my mentor. When the mentor doesn't have the answers, he has someone that he can approach. It's like, this is the question that Bruce has, and I don't have the answer. Can you help me? That's a really helpful system. And I think what we've created in Cultivate by making the local church the garden where the church planter is cultivated and prepared, and we come alongside like a trellis to support that plant, is a really exciting model for church planting. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in church planting, I would encourage you to download that church planting training manual, to talk with one of the leaders in your local Calvary Chapel or in your local church and tell them that you're interested. And if they're not interested in preparing you, then please, I would encourage you to reach out to cultivatechurchplanting.org and contact us. And we'd love to assist you and contact your local church leadership to help you along that way to make sure you get the training you need, assuming you're ready to go for training. And again, the qualification to be trained to church plant is a lower threshold than the qualification to church plant. So getting started in a training program, it's an easier on-ramp.
Yeah, that's a good word, Bruce. Hey, I really appreciate you being on the show. And for our listeners, the Calvary Chapel Cooperative.com. You're going to find out more information about how to get connected there. And then obviously Cultivate Church Planting. We would love to give you that, or Bruce would love to offer that book to you free of charge for download. And check it out. I'm sure you'll find some great resources. But Bruce, thank you so much again for being with us.
Yeah, Brian, thank you for hosting this podcast and being not only a great host, but a great friend to me and so many. I'm grateful. Thank you.
All right. I love you, man. Yeah, thanks for being on the show. Hey, thanks for listening to the Cultivate Church Planting Podcast. Reminder, visit us online, cultivatechurchplanting.com, and also visit calvarychapelcooperative.com for more information on how you can get involved.